I was standing in a hospital hallway when a doctor slipped a note into my hand and told me to read it alone. One sentence changed everything. It warned me not to go home with my son, that someone was trying to take control of my life before morning. The person I trusted most had already begun rewriting my reality, piece by piece, while I believed he was helping me. And in that moment, I had to decide whether I was still safe or already losing everything without even realizing it. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I am 72 years old. I have lived in Sedona, Arizona for most of my adult life, in a small wooden house that sits just far enough from town to feel quiet, but not lonely. At least that is what it used to feel like. The Red Rock Mountains rise behind my backyard like ancient walls, glowing softly in the early morning light. For decades, that view never changed, and neither did the rhythm of my life. My husband, Richard, and I built this home together 34 years ago. We were not the kind of couple people wrote stories about. There were no grand gestures or dramatic moments. Instead, we had routines. He made coffee every morning at exactly 6. I watered the plants while he read the newspaper. In the evenings, we sat on the porch and watched the sun settle behind the rocks. It was simple, steady, and it made me feel safe in a way I never had to question. When Richard died, it was sudden. A heart attack, the doctor said. There had been no warning, no time to prepare. One day he was there, asking me if I wanted eggs or toast, and the next day the house was silent, in a way I did not recognize. Grief did not arrive loudly. It did not break things or make me scream. It simply sat beside me, quiet and constant, turning familiar spaces into something slightly unfamiliar. I continued my routines because I did not know what else to do. I still woke up early. I still made coffee, though it never tasted quite right. I walked the same path through the yard, read the same books, attended church on Sundays. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, everything felt hollow, like I was moving through a life that had lost its center. About 3 months after the funeral, my son Nathan came to visit. He had always been practical, the kind of man who approached problems with solutions already in mind. He stood in my kitchen, looking around as if assessing something invisible. He told me I should not be living alone anymore. He said it gently, but firmly, the way people speak when they believe they are right. At first, I resisted. This house had been my life. Every corner held a memory. But Nathan kept talking about safety, about responsibility, about how things could go wrong when no one was there to help. Eventually, I agreed. He moved in a week later, bringing his girlfriend Clara with him. Clara was polite, attentive, and always seemed to know what needed to be done before I said anything. She reorganized the kitchen cabinets within the first 2 days. Nathan fixed a loose railing on the porch, replaced a flickering light in the hallway, and adjusted the thermostat without asking. At first, it felt like relief. There was noise in the house again, footsteps, conversations drifting from one room to another, the sound of someone closing cabinets, turning on the television, moving through space with purpose. I told myself I was lucky. Not everyone had family willing to step in like this. And for a while, I believed that completely. But even in those early days, there were small moments I did not fully understand. Nathan moved through the house as if it already belonged to him. Clara rearranged things in ways that made sense to her, not to me. Nothing was wrong, not exactly, just slightly different. At the time, I told myself that was normal. I thought this was the beginning of healing. I did not realize it was the beginning of something else entirely. If you're still here and something about this situation feels a little off to you, comment number 1 below so I know you're paying attention. Because what seemed like help is about to turn into something much more unsettling. Let's move on to chapter 2. At first, the changes in my home felt like adjustments, the kind that naturally happen when more people begin sharing the same space. Nathan and Clara settled into a rhythm quickly, and for a while, I told myself that the small differences I noticed were simply part of that transition. It seemed reasonable that routines would shift. After all, I was no longer living alone. One of the first things that changed was the mail. For years, it had been my quiet ritual to walk down the short gravel path to the mailbox each afternoon. It was never about the letters themselves, but about the routine, the sense of continuity. One day, I realized I had not checked the mail in several days. When I mentioned it, Nathan told me he had already been bringing everything inside. He said it lightly, as if it were obvious, as if he were simply helping. I nodded and let it go, though something about it felt unfamiliar, as if a small piece of my day had been quietly removed. Soon after that, I noticed the bills were no longer appearing where they usually did. The stack that once sat neatly on the corner of the kitchen counter had disappeared. When I asked, Nathan explained that he had already taken care of them. He spoke with confidence, the kind that leaves little room for further questions. Clara stood nearby, agreeing that it made more sense this way. She said it would reduce stress for me, that I should not have to worry about paperwork anymore. I smiled and thanked them, because that was what seemed appropriate, but I could not ignore the strange feeling that followed. It was not discomfort exactly, but a subtle sense that something familiar had shifted beyond my reach. The changes extended beyond the house itself. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by with a pie, and we sat in the living room talking about ordinary things. When she asked how I had been sleeping, I answered honestly, saying that I had been doing better. Nathan, who had been standing near the doorway, gently corrected me. He said I had still been waking up during the night. His tone was calm, almost reassuring, but it carried an implication I did not fully understand. I felt a brief flicker of embarrassment, as if I had said something incorrect without realizing it. I tried to explain, but he only smiled and nodded, as though he were confirming something I had missed. Moments like that began to happen more often. Never confrontational, never direct, but consistent enough to leave a trace. Clara would occasionally ask if I had already eaten, even when the dishes were still in the sink. Nathan would remind me of small things I did not believe I had forgotten. Each time I dismissed it. Grief, I told myself, can blur the edges of memory. Then came the bank statement. I was sitting at the kitchen table one morning, going through the account summary online, more out of habit than necessity. Most of the charges were familiar: utilities, groceries, small everyday expenses. But one line stopped me. A recurring payment, modest but consistent, listed under a name I did not recognize: Sunrise Cognitive Living Center. I stared at it for a long time, trying to recall if I had signed something, agreed to something, authorized anything at all. Nothing came to mind. When I asked Nathan about it later, he did not hesitate. He said it was likely a mistake, perhaps a temporary authorization that would be reversed. His explanation was smooth, almost rehearsed, and Clara supported it immediately, suggesting that these kinds of errors happen more often than people realize. I wanted to believe them. It would have been easier to accept that explanation and move on. But something in me did not settle. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, I began to replay the past few weeks in my mind. the mail, the bills, the conversations, the quiet corrections. Each moment, on its own, seemed harmless. Together, they formed something I could no longer ignore. For the first time, I wondered if the problem was not my memory. I wondered if something around me was beginning to change in ways I did not fully understand. If you're starting to notice the small changes and they don't sit right with you, comment number 2 below. Trust me, those little details are building towards something much bigger. Now, let's continue to chapter 3. The day it happened began like any other, quiet and predictable in a way I had always found comforting. The morning air in Sedona carried that dry, gentle warmth that settles over the desert before the sun climbs too high. I had stepped into the backyard with a watering can, moving slowly between the plants Richard and I had grown together over the years. There was nothing unusual about the moment. No warning, no sign that anything was about to change. I remember bending slightly to reach a pot near the edge of the patio. When I stood up again, the world shifted just enough to catch me off guard. It was not dramatic, not even painful, just a brief wave of dizziness that made the ground feel uncertain beneath my feet. I steadied myself against the railing and waited for it to pass. Within seconds, it did. My breathing returned to normal, and the stillness of the yard settled back into place. It would have ended there, a minor moment forgotten by afternoon, if Nathan had not been watching from inside the house. He was outside before I could set the watering can down, his expression already tightened with concern. The way he moved toward me carried a sense of urgency that did not match what I had just experienced. I told him I was fine. I explained that it had only been a moment, that I had probably stood up too quickly, but he did not seem to hear me. His focus was fixed on something else, something larger than what had actually happened. Within minutes, he insisted we go to the hospital in Flagstaff. I resisted at first, quietly but firmly, but the insistence grew. Clara appeared beside him, echoing his concern, adding weight to his argument. Their voices remained calm, but the pressure behind them was undeniable. Eventually, I agreed, not because I believed I needed medical attention, but because refusing seemed to create more tension than accepting. The drive felt longer than usual. Nathan kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting near the gear shift, as if ready to react at any moment. Clara sat in the passenger seat, occasionally turning back to look at me with a soft, reassuring expression. No one spoke much. The silence was not peaceful. It felt measured. The hospital environment was exactly what I remembered from years before. Bright lights, clean floors, and a quiet efficiency that made everything feel controlled and distant. As soon as we arrived, Nathan stepped forward to speak at the front desk before I could say anything. I stood beside him, listening as he explained my condition in a way that sounded unfamiliar, as though he were describing someone else. During the intake process, the pattern continued. Questions were asked, but answers often came from Nathan first. He mentioned memory issues, small confusions, things I did not fully recognize as my own experiences. Clara added details, reinforcing the picture he was painting. I tried to respond when I could, but my voice seemed to arrive a moment too late each time. When the doctor, Dr. Alan Pierce, finally examined me, his approach was calm and direct. He asked simple questions. I answered them clearly. The date, the location, recent events. There was no hesitation in my responses. For a brief moment, I felt reassured, certain that whatever narrative had been forming would dissolve under something as straightforward as truth. But Nathan continued to speak. He described incidents, small moments framed as evidence, repetition, confusion, concern. The words were careful, measured, and persistent. They did not sound like accusations. They sounded like concern, which made them harder to challenge. At some point, Nathan stepped out of the room to take a phone call. The shift in the space was immediate. The quiet that followed felt different, more focused. Dr. Pierce looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, as if weighing something he had not yet said. Then, without explanation, he reached for a small piece of paper, folded it once, and placed it gently into my hand. He did not speak. He only held my gaze for a second before turning away. I waited until I was alone in the restroom before opening it. My hands felt unsteady as I unfolded the paper. The message was short, written in quick, deliberate handwriting. Do not leave with your son tonight. Legal action may already be in motion. I read it again, certain I had misunderstood. The words did not change. They settled into place with a weight that made my chest tighten. For a moment, I stood there in silence, listening to the faint hum of the lights above me, trying to steady my breathing. Memories began to surface, not in order, but all at once. The mail, the bills, the conversations, the subtle corrections. Each piece that had once felt isolated now seemed connected in a way I could no longer ignore. When I stepped back into the hallway, everything looked the same. The same polished floors, the same quiet movement of staff and patients. And at the end of the corridor, Nathan was standing there, waiting for me with a calm, familiar expression. For the first time in my life, I looked at my son and felt something I had never felt before. I did not know if going home with him was safe. If you feel like things just crossed a line and there's no going back now, comment number 3 below. Because what happens next will make everything even more real. Let's move on to chapter 4. I stood in the hospital hallway with the folded note still pressed inside my hand, feeling as though the ground beneath me had shifted in a way no one else could see. At the far end of the corridor, Nathan waited exactly where I had left him. His posture was relaxed, one shoulder against the wall, his attention briefly on his phone. There was nothing unusual about the way he stood there, nothing threatening. And yet, everything about him felt different now. For a moment, I considered walking straight toward him and asking for an explanation. The thought rose quickly, driven by instinct and disbelief. But just as quickly it faded. The words on the note echoed in my mind with quiet urgency. Legal action may already be in motion. Whatever was happening, it was already underway, and confronting him without understanding it could make things worse. I forced my breathing to slow and stepped forward, careful to keep my expression steady. When Nathan looked up, he smiled in that familiar way that had always reassured me. He asked if I was ready to go home. The word home felt heavier than it should have. I told him I thought the doctor might want to run a few additional tests, that I still felt slightly unsteady and preferred to stay a little longer. The explanation sounded reasonable, even to me, but I watched his reaction closely. There was a brief pause, almost imperceptible, before he responded. He questioned the need, suggesting that I would be more comfortable resting at home. His tone remained calm, but there was a firmness beneath it that I had not noticed before. I repeated myself, gently, but with enough certainty to leave little room for argument. After a moment, he nodded, though the ease in his expression did not fully return. He said he would wait downstairs and come back in the morning. When he walked away, I felt the first small release of tension in my chest. It did not bring relief, only space to think. I made my way down to the hospital lobby, where the quiet movement of people created a sense of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the thoughts racing through my mind. I found a seat near the window and unfolded the note again, reading the words slowly as if they might change. They did not. Beneath the message, I noticed a brief instruction I had overlooked earlier. It suggested speaking to a hospital social worker if I felt unsafe. That was the first clear step I had. At the information desk, I asked for assistance, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Within minutes, I was guided into a small office where a woman introduced herself as a social worker. The room felt contained, private, and for the first time since reading the note, I felt as though I could speak without being interrupted. As I explained what had happened, her expression shifted from polite attentiveness to focused concern. She listened carefully, then began to explain something I had never considered before. Emergency guardianship, she said, could be initiated quickly if someone presented evidence that an individual was unable to manage their own affairs. Medical records, observations, and documented behavior could all be used to support that claim. The structure of it unfolded in my mind with unsettling clarity. I asked how quickly something like that could happen. Her answer was simple. It could happen faster than most people expect. She advised me not to return to the same environment if I felt uncertain. She suggested I stay somewhere neutral, contact someone I trusted, and make sure my documents were secure. As she spoke, one name came to mind without hesitation. Margaret. I stepped back into the lobby and glanced toward the entrance. Through the glass doors, I could see Nathan outside, pacing slowly as he spoke on his phone. The image sent a quiet surge of urgency through me. I called Margaret. When she answered, I explained everything as clearly as I could. The shift in her voice was immediate. She did not hesitate or question the seriousness of what I was saying. She told me not to go home, not to confront Nathan, and to leave as soon as possible without drawing attention. She explained that cases like this often involve preparation, that documentation could be built over time without the person realizing it. Her certainty steadied me. We agreed on a plan. I would tell Nathan I was staying overnight, then leave separately and go directly to her house. When I stepped outside, Nathan ended his call and turned toward me. I repeated the explanation about staying for observation. He seemed reluctant, but he did not push further. After a brief pause, he agreed to return in the morning. I watched him walk toward the parking lot until his car disappeared from view. Only then did I realize how tightly I had been holding my breath. A short time later, I was in the back of a rideshare car, the city lights of Flagstaff fading behind me as we drove toward Sedona. The road stretched ahead in quiet darkness, and for the first time, I allowed myself to fully acknowledge what was happening. This was no longer confusion. This was something deliberate. When we pulled up to Margaret's house, the porch light was already on. She opened the door before I could knock, her expression serious, focused, and entirely certain. As I stepped inside, I understood something clearly. I was no longer trying to make sense of a situation. I was stepping into a fight. If you're beginning to see the pattern clearly and it's making you uneasy, comment number 4 below. The truth is closer than it seems, and the next part changes everything. Let's continue. I did not sleep that night. The guest room in Margaret's house was quiet and comfortable, but my mind refused to settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the note again, the words repeating themselves in a steady rhythm that left no room for rest. By morning, I felt as though I had already lived through another full day. Margaret was awake before I came downstairs. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a notepad, her posture straight, her expression focused. There was no hesitation in her movements, no uncertainty in the way she approached the situation. It steadied me in a way I had not expected. She told me we needed a lawyer. Within an hour, we were sitting across from Daniel Brooks, a man whose calm demeanor made everything feel both more serious and more manageable at the same time. His office was quiet, organized, filled with shelves of legal books that seemed to absorb the weight of the conversation. I explained everything again, this time more carefully, more deliberately. The words came easier now, shaped by the clarity that had begun to form overnight. He listened without interruption. When I finished, He asked a series of precise questions. Had I signed documents recently? Who currently had access to my accounts? Whether I had noticed unusual financial activity. Each question felt like it was pulling a thread that had been quietly woven into my life. He explained what those threads could mean. Power of attorney, he said, could allow someone to manage my finances legally. Guardianship could go even further, giving control over decisions about my life itself. Both were legitimate tools, but both could be misused if obtained under false pretenses. As he spoke, the structure of what might have been happening became clearer and more unsettling. Then he suggested something that made my chest tighten. We needed to go back to the house. The drive felt shorter than it should have. When we arrived, everything looked exactly the same. The red rocks in the distance, the porch, the front door I had walked through thousands of times. But the familiarity no longer felt comforting. It felt deceptive. Inside, nothing appeared out of place. The furniture was where it had always been. The air carried the faint scent of lemon cleaner Clara preferred. For a moment, I wondered if we would find nothing at all, if everything would collapse back into uncertainty. The investigator who accompanied us did not hesitate. He moved through the space with a quiet efficiency, opening drawers, scanning surfaces, looking for patterns rather than objects. In the kitchen, he began sorting through documents with practiced focus. Bills, statements, authorization forms. He paused occasionally, setting certain papers aside. One of them caught my attention. A financial authorization document connected to Sunrise Cognitive Living Center. My name was on it. I felt a slow, heavy realization settle in my chest. I had no memory of signing it, yet there it was, part of a system already in motion. Then he found the folder. It was placed in a drawer, as if it belonged there, labeled in clear, deliberate handwriting, Evelyn Transition Strategy. For a moment, none of us moved. The words themselves felt unreal, as though they belonged to a different life. When he opened it, the air in the room seemed to change. Inside was a plan. Not vague ideas or scattered notes, but a structured outline. Steps, timelines, objectives. The first step described documenting signs of memory decline. The second focused on securing financial control. The third outlined placement in a care facility. The fourth referenced legal escalation if resistance occurred. Each line mirrored something I had lived through. I stood there, reading my own life reduced to a sequence of actions. Then another document surfaced, a preliminary agreement listing the house for sale. My house. The realization struck with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was not about helping me. It was about removing me. Every step, every conversation, every quiet adjustment had been part of something larger. As I looked around the room, I understood something that had not fully formed until that moment. If I had gone home from the hospital, the final step would have already begun, and I would not have seen it coming. I remained standing in the kitchen long after the folder had been closed, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter as if I needed something solid to hold me in place. The room looked exactly as it always had. The same cabinets, the same worn wood surface, the same view through the window where the red rocks rose in the distance. But none of it felt familiar anymore. It felt staged, like a carefully arranged setting for something I had never agreed to be part of. Margaret and Daniel Brooks spoke quietly behind me, their voices steady, practical, focused on what needed to happen next. They discussed legal options with a clarity that felt both reassuring and overwhelming. Freeze the accounts, challenge the authorization, notify the bank, prevent the property transaction from moving forward. Each step was precise, logical, necessary, but there was something else beneath all of it. Time. Daniel explained that the documents we found were not theoretical. They were active. The listing agreement for the house was already in motion, and any delay could allow it to progress beyond a point we could easily stop. The words settled heavily in my mind. Waiting was no longer a neutral choice. Waiting meant risk. I listened to them outline two paths. One was quiet and procedural, moving through legal channels carefully, building a case, letting the system work. The other was immediate, direct, confronting Nathan before he could take another step. For a moment, I said nothing. I looked around the kitchen again, letting my eyes settle on the small details that had once made the space feel like mine. The faint scratch on the table from years ago, the chair Richard always used, the way the afternoon light fell across the floor. This was my home, and someone had already begun trying to take it from me. The realization did not come with anger at first. It came with clarity, a quiet understanding that if I stepped back now, if I allowed this to continue even one more day, I might lose more than I could recover. I turned back toward them and told them I did not want to wait. The words felt simple, but they carried more weight than anything I had said in a long time. Margaret nodded immediately. Daniel's expression remained calm, but I saw a small shift of approval in his eyes. The decision had been made. We would confront Nathan. The plan formed quickly after that. I would call him and tell him I had been discharged. I would say I was home and ready to talk about next steps. Nothing in my voice could suggest hesitation or suspicion. He needed to believe everything was still unfolding as he expected. When I picked up my phone, my hand was steady in a way that surprised me. The fear had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer something that held me back. It was something that sharpened my focus. Nathan answered on the second ring. His tone was familiar, controlled, reassuring. I told him I was home. I told him I wanted to talk. There was a brief pause, then a shift in his voice, something almost eager beneath the surface. He said he would come over that evening. He mentioned moving forward, taking care of things, making sure everything was handled properly. I listened carefully, hearing his words in a way I never had before. When the call ended, the house fell quiet again. Margaret and Daniel moved into preparation, organizing the documents, arranging the evidence, deciding how the conversation would unfold. Their movements were deliberate, efficient, grounded in experience. I stepped away from the kitchen and walked slowly through the house. Each room carried a memory. The living room where Richard and I spent our evenings, the hallway where Nathan once ran as a child, the bedroom that still held the quiet absence of someone I had loved for most of my life. I paused by the window and looked out at the fading light. This confrontation was not just about stopping a plan. It was about facing what my son had become. For the first time since all of this began, I realized I was not waiting to understand what was happening anymore. I was waiting to face it. If you're still here and you can feel the tension building before the confrontation, comment number 6 below. Because what happens next will expose everything. Now let's move on to chapter 7. Nathan arrived just as the last light of evening slipped behind the red rocks. The house had already grown quiet, the kind of silence that does not feel peaceful, but deliberate. Inside, everything was arranged with intention. The documents were placed neatly on the dining table. Margaret sat to my left. Daniel Brooks stood near the far end, composed and observant. When Nathan stepped through the door, his expression carried the same calm confidence I had seen so many times before, but it shifted almost immediately. His eyes moved across the room, taking in the presence of strangers, the stillness, the papers waiting on the table. Confusion came first, then something sharper. He asked what was going on. Daniel answered before I could. His introduction was brief, direct, leaving no ambiguity about why he was there. The word attorney changed the atmosphere instantly. Nathan straightened slightly, his posture tightening as he tried to regain control of a situation he no longer understood. The conversation began slowly. Daniel placed the first document in front of him. The heading alone was enough to break the illusion. Evelyn Transition Strategy. Nathan looked at it, then at me, then back again. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he dismissed it, calling it a misunderstanding, something taken out of context. More documents followed. The financial authorization forms, the recurring payments to Sunrise Cognitive Living Center, the preliminary agreement to list the house for sale. Each piece was placed calmly, one after another, until the space between us was filled with proof. Nathan's responses shifted as the silence grew heavier. He stopped denying the existence of the documents. Instead, he began explaining them. He said he had been trying to help. He said I had been struggling. He spoke about my memory, my safety, my future, each word carefully chosen to sound reasonable. Then the truth surfaced. His business had failed. The debts were significant, more than I had ever imagined. Creditors were closing in, and he believed everything he owned was at risk. His solution had been to take control before anything could be taken from him, from us. He said it as if that made it acceptable. I listened without interrupting. The anger I expected to feel never came. What replaced it was something quieter, heavier. I realized that he believed what he was saying. In his mind, this was not betrayal. It was protection. Daniel pointed out the legal reality, the manipulation, the misuse of authority. Margaret spoke more directly, calling his reasoning what it was. But Nathan kept returning to the same idea. He was doing this for me. At some point, his voice softened. He said he loved me, that everything he had done was meant to keep me safe, to make sure I would be taken care of when things became too difficult for me to manage alone. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw something I had not seen before. Not a son protecting his mother, but a man who had convinced himself that control and care were the same thing. And in that moment, I understood something I could not undo. The person standing in front of me was no longer the son I had trusted. The room did not feel as tense as it had moments before, but the weight of what had been said remained in the air. Nathan stood near the table, no longer leaning forward with confidence, no longer directing the conversation. His posture had changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. He was no longer in control. Daniel Brooks stepped forward slightly, his voice calm and measured as he shifted the focus away from emotion and into something more structured. He spoke about legal responsibility, about the consequences of misusing authority, about the difference between intention and action. His words were precise, leaving little space for interpretation. What Nathan had done was not simply a misunderstanding. It was an attempt to take control of someone else's life under false pretenses. Nathan tried to respond, but the certainty he had shown earlier was gone. His words came slower, less defined, as if he were searching for ground that no longer existed beneath him. He insisted that he had not meant harm, that everything he did had been driven by necessity. But even as he spoke, the argument felt thinner. Daniel presented two paths. One involved formal legal action, court filings, investigations, consequences that could extend far beyond this room. The other was immediate compliance, withdrawal of all claims, cancellation of all arrangements, and acknowledgement of what had been done. Silence followed. I remained still, watching Nathan as he absorbed what was being offered. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this was no longer something he could manage or redirect. The situation had moved beyond him. Then another layer of truth surfaced. Clara's involvement became clearer through the documents on the table. Her connection to the investment company, her role in shaping the plan, her potential benefit from the sale of the house. It added a dimension I had not fully considered before. This had not been a solitary decision. It had been reinforced, encouraged. Nathan reacted quickly, attempting to downplay her role, to shift the focus back to himself. But it did not change the reality. The responsibility remained his. Daniel placed the documents in front of him. Revocation of authority, withdrawal of financial access, cancellation of the property agreement. The pen rested beside the papers, small and unremarkable, yet carrying the weight of everything that had happened. Nathan hesitated. For a moment, I saw something familiar in him again. Not the man who had constructed the plan, but the son who once stood uncertain when faced with consequences. Then he reached forward and signed. The sound of the pen moving across the paper was quiet, but final. Daniel gathered the documents, confirming that the necessary steps would be taken immediately. The bank would be notified. The facility would be contacted. The process would be reversed. Nathan stepped back, his gaze shifting toward me. He spoke softly, offering something that resembled an apology, though it lacked clarity. I listened, but I did not respond. There was nothing left to say in that moment that could change what had already been done. After a few seconds, he turned and walked toward the door. When it closed behind him, the house fell silent again. I stood there, aware of something that felt both relieving and heavy at the same time. I had taken back control of my life, but I could not take back what had been lost. If you've made it this far and you're wondering what the final outcome will be, comment number 8 below. The ending isn't just about what was lost, but what was finally reclaimed. Let's move to the conclusion. The next morning arrived quietly, as if nothing had happened. Sunlight slipped through the windows and stretched across the kitchen floor in the same way it always had. For a moment, I stood there and watched it, trying to understand how something so ordinary could exist alongside everything that had changed. The house felt different, not because anything had moved, but because I now understood what had almost been taken from me. Every room carried a new awareness. The kitchen where I had signed papers without thinking. The living room where conversations had slowly reshaped my reality. The hallway that once held only memories now held something else entirely. Margaret called early to check on me. Her voice was steady, grounding, as she confirmed that the legal steps were already in motion. The bank accounts had been secured, the authorization had been revoked, the facility had been notified, the sale of the house had been stopped. Each confirmation felt like a piece of something being restored, not just control, but clarity. I thanked her, though the words felt smaller than what I meant. Nathan had not called. His absence lingered in the quiet of the house. It was not a peaceful silence. It was something heavier, something that left space for thoughts I could not easily resolve. I found myself wondering if he understood what he had done, or if he still believed he had been right. I moved slowly through the house, touching small things as I passed. The edge of the table, the back of a chair, the frame of a photograph. Each one reminded me that this life had been built over time, not given, not borrowed, and certainly not something that could be taken without consequence. Later that afternoon, I arranged for the locks to be changed. It was a simple decision, practical and necessary, but it carried weight. As I watched the locksmith work, I realized that reclaiming control was not a single moment. It was a series of choices, each one reinforcing the last. By evening, the house was quiet again. But this time, the silence felt different. It no longer belonged to fear, it belonged to me. In the quiet that followed everything, I found myself returning to the same moment again and again. Not the confrontation, not the documents, not even the realization of what had been planned. It was that single moment in the hospital when a folded piece of paper changed the direction of my life. I had trusted without question for most of my life. I believed that family meant safety, that love meant protection, and for many years, that belief had been true. But I learned that trust, when left unexamined, can also become a blind spot. What happened to me did not begin with something obvious. It began with small shifts, subtle changes, quiet corrections that seemed harmless until they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The most dangerous part was not the plan itself, but how easily it was hidden inside what looked like care. I do not see myself as someone who was powerless. I see myself as someone who almost missed the moment when things changed. And I understand now how important it is to listen to that quiet instinct when something feels wrong. There were people who helped me see clearly, people who chose to speak when it would have been easier to stay silent. If there is one thing I would want anyone to remember, it is this: your life belongs to you, and no one has the right to rewrite it without your voice. In the end, life does not always test us with loud, obvious dangers. Sometimes it arrives quietly, hidden inside familiar voices and trusted hands. It is in those moments that awareness becomes our greatest protection. Independence is not just about living alone or making decisions. It is about recognizing when something no longer feels right and having the courage to pause, question, and choose again. There is a quiet strength in listening to yourself, even when it means standing against what you once believed. And there is wisdom in understanding that care and control are not the same, no matter how gently they are presented. The truth is, what we protect defines the life we continue to live. And sometimes, protecting your voice is the most important choice you will ever make. Thank you for being here and sharing this journey. If this story made you think or feel something, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments and consider following for more stories like this.